Hey everyone, Heero here, and today we're gonna look at Summer Robin, Best Girl's new form that enables massive damage with her insane buffing and support utility. I'll be discussing her kit, builds, lightcones, and possible teams. Just as a quick disclaimer though, the footage and information shown is from the creator experience server, so some things could still change when her banner drops. Now let's first start with her basic, which is her fairly standard basic attack that deals damage while having no special effects, so sadly you will never use it. As for her skill, it either summons her Memosprite or heals them if they're already on field. And this is on top of giving her 6 vibes per use, but I'll talk more about what vibes are later. Now, her Memosprite comes in the form of a trio called the Summer Songbirds, whose initial max HP is equal to 70% of Robin's HP, while their initial speed is equal to 180% of Robin's speed. And when they are first summoned, they regen 20 energy for Robin, but if they are ever killed, they give Robin a 50% action advance. And these birds are closely related to her Vibes mechanic. Now Vibes is her unique resource that can stack up to 50 points, with her skill giving her 6 stacks per use, while her talent gives her 1 stack every time an ally attacks, and 1 stack when an ally provides healing or shields for the first time during any target's turn. This is all on top of her special guests and their summons giving an additional 2 stacks after attacking. But the cool thing is, thanks to her A2 passive, whenever any teammate causes Robin to gain vibes, and of course this includes her own Memosprites, said teammates can gain 1 of 2 buffs depending on their attack stat, with both buffs lasting for 2 turns. If their attack is higher than Robin's, they gain an attack buff calculated using Robin's HP and the amount of vibes she currently has, and at 50 vibes, they should give up to 36% of Robin's HP as an attack buff. But if their attack stat is lower than Robin's, they gain a crit damage buff instead, calculated using her vibes, and at max vibes, they should give up to 115 crit damage as a buff. Moving on, if you summon her Memosprite with less than 6 vibes, only 1 of them appears. But once you reach 6 vibes, Drummy appears, and once you have 12, Paddy shows up. But thanks to her Memosprite talent, depending on the number of birds that are currently present, the enemy gets inflicted with a damage vulnerability debuff. This goes from an 8% damage vulnerability with 1 bird, all the way to 16% with all 3 birds present. And once all 3 birds are on field, it dispels all crowd control debuffs on Robin and the Summer Birds, deploys a zone, and finally, Robin and her birds enter the fever state, which is a lot of things happening at once, so let's first talk about her zone. Now, her zone is up for as long as Robin is in the fever state, and it gives all allies a Def Ignore buff for as long as it's active. Now, this buff gives a base 15% Def Ignore plus a percentage determined by her total vibes. So at max 50 vibes, her zone gives a whopping 40% Def Ignore. But now, we can talk about her fever state, which is outlined by her Memosprite talent. First of all, during the fever state, Robin and her Summer Birds are immune to all crowd control debuffs. But as a trade-off, Robin cannot take turns until the fever state is over. But it is worth to mention that you can actually keep extremely high uptime of her fever state, so it's highly likely she'll never get turns once she enters the state. Next, upon the state's activation, the Summer Songbirds appear in the action bar, and during their turn, they use their Memosprite skill to attack the enemy, which is just a huge HP scaling AoE, and yes, her Memosprite's attacks can also generate vibes. But to complement this, during the fever state, Robin and the Summer Birds gain a vibe scaling damage buff, which can give them up to a 160% damage buff at 50 vibes. Now, aside from the Summer Birds, a countdown also appears in the action bar during her fever state. This countdown has an initial 140 speed, and during its turns, it deducts 50% of Robin's vibes, with it always deducting a minimum of 12 stacks if 50% ever equates to less than 12 vibes. And once Robin reaches 0 vibes, her fever state ends, and the Summer Birds all disappear into the KFC bucket. But anyway, as for her ult, it gives one target ally a 100% action advance on top of also regenerating their energy by a fixed amount equal to 20% of their max energy while giving them the special guest buff. Now, whenever the unit with special guest and their summon attacks, they additionally grant Robin 2 vibes for a total of 3 per attack. Just note, special guest only lasts for 2 turns, and units with the buff cannot advance other units' actions, so do not use her ult on units like the RMC or Sunday. But going back, her ultimate being an off-turn action advance that gives energy on top of it not being tied to any offensive buffs gives it a ton of versatility. Meaning, you can save and time her action advance to help you better deal with certain scenarios. It also means you can use it on whoever you want, not just your DPSs. For example, you can use it to advance and battery another support to help make more use of their utility to enable even more damage for your DPS. But moving on to her A4 passive, it grants her 12 stacks of Groove whenever she is shielded or healed. Now, Groove can only stack up to 12 times, and 1 stack is consumed every time she gains vibes during any target's turn to regen a fixed 3 energy. As for her A6, it just gives Robin and her Songbirds 50% crit rate, which is neat for helping them deal decent damage. And finally, for her technique, it grants her a 20% action advance at the start of combat, while giving a 2-turn 30% team-wide damage buff on top of giving Robin 6 vibes. Which, when combined with her skill, puts her at 12 vibes, letting her start combat with all 3 birds and the fever state. As for her talent prio, level up her Memosprite talent and regular talent first to maximize her buffs, then level up her ult to maximize its energy regen effect. After which, you can level up her Memosprite skill to maximize her damage, and finally, you can just ignore her basic and regular skill.
With her kit out of the way, we can talk about her Eidolons.
Her E1 enables her Songbirds to keep a tally of 100% of the non-true damage dealt by the entire party. And whenever the birds use their Memosprite skill, they deal true damage based off the damage tally and Robin's total vibes to the enemy with the highest HP. But to not overcomplicate it, this does end up adding up to a lot of damage by the end of the battle. And the insane thing is, this is very similar to 3B's E1 in a sense that it scales well into multi-target, allowing you to condense high multi-target damage into high single-target damage, which is helpful especially for AoE-centric units when it comes to dealing with multi-target bosses. But overall, due to how insane this Eidolon is, just like with 3B, this E1 is generally recommended over her S1 when it comes to vertical investment priority, while her E2 increases all allies' rest span by 18% as long as she's in the party, while increasing her max vibes by 20 for a total cap of 70 vibes. Which also increases her buffing potential, with her being able to now give up to a 50% def ignore on top of a max 44% of her HP as an attack buff or a max 145% crit damage buff. And to complement this Eidolon also gives her an additional 2 vibes the first time any ally uses an ability during any turn. As for her E4, upon entering the fever state, it gives Robin 12 vibes while increasing the speed of her summer birds depending on her vibes, with it being able to give up to a 55% speed buff, which is neat. And finally, for her E6, it increases her Memosprite skill damage multiplier to 100% of its original value. But aside from this, it also allows her to store up to 2 ults, which is neat since you can now save her ults to better time her advances with less worry of wasting energy. And to complement this, she now gains a fixed 140 energy after the first time she enters her fever state and whenever its countdown takes a turn, which by the way is a free ult, which is insane for batterying any type of unit and increasing overall damage output.
With her Eidolons out of the way, let's talk about Lightcones.
Robin's really pretty signature increases her HP by 30% just by equipping it, while enabling her to restore 1 SP after every time you use her ult. Aside from this, upon entering combat, it gives her a 30% action advance while giving her the new melody buff for 2 turns. Now while Robin holds this buff, he gives all allies a 20% speed buff. Now the neat thing is, despite this cone speed buff only lasting for 2 turns, Robin usually enters her fever state at her 2nd turn, so she can pretty much keep permanent uptime of the buff due to her not taking turns during it. Now the speed buff does help your units reach certain speed breakpoints much easier, like helping Cyrene and Silverwolf have an easier time reaching 200 speed. But of course, some teams simply don't care for the speed buff or the content is too short to take proper advantage of it. But generally, its value all depends on the team and content you're running, their current speed, and if the buff can help them reach the speed breakpoints to get more turns in the content you're running. As for alternatives, you have the Hertoshop Cone for its speed and damage buff. Now the speed is of course pretty nice for helping her birds reach certain speed breakpoints. Its only downside is that the party-wide damage buff from this light cone will eventually disappear due to Robin losing her turns during her fever state, which does have a pretty much permanent uptime. You can also use HP stat sticks like high base HP light cones, the story's next page, or even Castoris' signature, all of which help with her damage while enabling her to give a bigger attack buff for attack scaling teams. You can also use Hyacinth's signature for more speed, on top of its 18% damage vulnerability debuff, which her birds can easily keep full uptime up. And finally, there's also Cyrene's signature for its high base HP and good personal speed buff, on top of its party-wide 16% crit damage buff. But of course, it's worth noting that if you're running Robin with the owners of these signatures, it's much better to keep it on them, since she still does fine with options like the Hertoshop Cone and the next page.
But with her light cones out of the way, let's look at possible relics.
Her best set would generally be the Deliverer, not only for its max HP and crit rate buff, but also for its party-wide 15% damage buff. And the neat thing is, not only can multiple copies of this set in a team stack, its buff duration heavily depends on when Robin gets her next turn, and as we know, her turns disappear during her fever state, so its damage buff can have a pretty much permanent uptime. But you can also use a 2-piece combo of any speed set as a temporary option if you don't have good Deliverer pieces lying around, or if you simply need to hit high speed breakpoints to help her birds get tons of turns. As for planar sets, she has tons of options. There's Amphorius for its party-wide speed buff to help teammates reach speed breakpoints, get more or faster turns for vibe stacking and damage, or simply buff speed scaling units like Silverwolf. But if its speed buff isn't really doing much for the party, you also have the ER options to help her get her ult way more often. Loshaka works for attack scaling teams, but since she gives a ton of attack already, this set gives a ton of diminishing returns.
There's also Penacony if you're running her with a wind DPS like Saber, Anxa, or Feixiao. And finally, there's Von Whack if you're having trouble getting her to act first to activate her fever state and summon her birds. But just note, her signature plus her technique already provide a 50% advance at the start of combat, so only use this set if those aren't enough to get her to act first, or if you don't have her signature.
With her possible sets out of the way, let's talk about stats.
Now she has a base HP of 1003, a base attack of 601, and a base speed of 95, with her minor traces giving her 14 speed, 18% HP, and 7% crit rate. So in total, she gets 57% crit rate and 109 speed from her kit. On top of the crit damage bonuses her birds can get in combat through her A2, so make sure to consider all of that when building. For main stats, for the chest and orb, it depends on the team. But generally, for attack scaling teams, you'd want an HP orb and chest to ensure her talent gives as much attack as it can with its buff. But for non-attack scaling teams, it's a bit more flexible since her HP doesn't matter when it comes to buffing those teams. While HP is still pretty good for her personal damage, a crit chest and wind orb does become an option for maximizing her damage. For the boots, speed is the best to help her birds act faster and get more turns for faster vibe stacking, energy generation, and more damage, especially if you have her E1. And you want to use an ER rope to help her birds generate enough energy to consistently use her ult. Now, since Robin is a pretty variable unit, I'm not gonna give exact stat goals, but instead, I'll just state some pretty important notes to help build her effectively. So let's first talk about speed. Well, yes, Robin will barely take turns. Like I said, her speed is extremely important for getting more bird turns. Faster birds means faster vibe stacking, more energy generation, more ults, better resource generation for some units, and more overall damage. So the best genuine advice is just to get as much speed as you can on top of HP. But here are some concrete goals you can go for if you want to min-max her turns in MOC. There's 185.2 speed or 186 speed to let her birds act within 30 AV and get 5 turns right after the wave switch in MOC. But that's honestly really painful to get, seeing how you only need a minimum of 148.2 speed for them to act within 38 AV for 4 bird turns right after a MOC wave switch. However, outside of MOC, it's a bit more complicated to speed tune for her bird's turns because things like the timing of when she can reach 12 vibes, Von Whack, DDD, her teammates, her signature, and more are all factors that can affect it. So there is no one-size-fits-all solution to help with this. And honestly, unless you're aiming for hyper-optimized runs, there's no need to speed tune too much for her bird's turns, and she can function perfectly fine without doing so. So again, my advice is just to run a high-speed Robin by getting as much speed as you can and call it a day. As for HP, for attack scaling teams, just like with speed, just get as much HP as you can. Her attack buff doesn't have a cap, so getting a lot of HP ensures Robin can give as big of an attack buff as possible. Plus, it's also really good for her personal damage, so the same philosophy also works for non-attack scaling teams, just to save you the hassle of farming extra relics for her. The build I used while testing hovered around 7k HP for both attack and non-attack scaling teams, and it functioned pretty well. So you can make that an HP goal to aim for, but you can always get more than that. While for crit stats, despite her decent damage, it's not an absolute necessity to build for them since building stats for her support utility comes first. So just get however much you can on top of her speed and HP stat. But just note for Remembrance teams with Evernight, Robin can get a lot of crit damage in that team already, so crit rate is appreciated for that comp. And finally, for non-attack scaling teams, make sure her attack is higher than your DPS's. Some of said teams like Ava comps can get more attack than Robin, especially if the relic rolls with attack substats. So if it's ever needed, you might need to invest in some attack substats or even an attack main stat on Robin.
But with her build out of the way, let's move on to possible teammates.
Summer Robin is a generalist buffer that can pretty much fit in any non-break oriented team due to her pretty universal support utility, action advances, battery potential, great generalist buffs, and ability to switch between a crit damage or attack buff to better support the party. Just make sure to tune her attack appropriately for non-attack scaling teams so she can give them her crit damage buff, because some of them like Ava teams can have higher attack than her if you aren't careful. But speaking of which, let's first talk about my favorite, Ava, who really appreciates Robin's generic buffing and energy, with Robin being able to be used instead of Wokwo to make a great sustainless team. Ava really hates the action advance, but there are some ways to get around it. First, you can use Robin's ult on Ava during her turn so she can still get the energy and certified banger without the detriments of an action advance. And finally, you can always just give Robin's ult either to the EMC or Yao Guang to help with their energy rotation to enable Ava's damage even further. Now she can't replace Yao Guang for this team, and while yes, she can technically work in the place of the EMC, Robin's E1 is recommended so Robin can fully compensate for losing the EMC and in some cases even become a really competitive option. But moving on, she can also work for Wolfie either in a sustainless team or as the third option for her generic buffing. But her main draw for this team is her ability to battery Yao Guang for more Elation skills, which of course is insane for Silver Wolf's damage and certified banger gain. Plus, it's worth to mention that Robin's S1 is great for buffing Wolfie's speed, while her defense ignore buff also pairs really well with Wolfie's S1 and Yao Guang's E1. Now, I wouldn't really say she's replacing Sparksy in the team, but she's more of a really good alternative if you don't have her. But again, if you have Robin's E1, she does become a pretty competitive third slot support. As for DOT, well, it's kinda hard to fit Robin in this team unless you're running it as a sustainless team. Just because DOT really likes its core team and replacing anyone in it aside from the sustain is kinda awkward. And for the most part, to improve the team, instead of Robin, it's usually better to roll for either Black Swan or Hysolence if you don't have them, or their vertical investment. However, again, she does still work for sustainless for her higher damage, but the trade-off is the team does become harder to play. And you can still use her if you're missing Black Swan, running Windrest content, or if you have enough vertical investment on Robin to outweigh Black Swan's contribution to the team, which can happen with low vertical investment DOT teams. Robin can also work on a Phainon and Cyrene team since her buffs are insane for his damage. But I wouldn't run them without Cyrene since Robin's core flame generation is terrible. Which doesn't matter with Cyrene since she gives Phainon a permanent transformation. But just a few notes. First, you can use her ult on a pre-E2 Cyrene to speed up her ramp up. Second, make sure to have as much vibes as you can before entering Phainon's transformation to ensure he gets the most out of Robin's buffs. And finally, there are some anti-synergies with this team, like her birds or E1 not working during his transformation and her ult becoming useless afterwards. Next is Archer teams, with him appreciating her buffing utility, especially for defense reduction stacking, on top of him being great for vibe stacking. She can be used either in sustainless or as an alternative to Rin or Sparkle if you don't have them. However, if you're using her as an alternative to Sparkle, it is preferred to have Archer's E1 to make up for the loss of Sparkle's SP generation. Now, she's not necessarily an upgrade to Sparkle, and Archer's core team is still most definitely his best one, so she's not a must-pull for the team. But it's worth noting that her action advance is really easy to time around Rin's turns without the need of any speed tuning, which helps with consistent joint attacks. And if ever Rin gets lapped by Sparkle, Robin can help by simply advancing Rin before Sparkle's turn. But moving on, Robin also works well with both Anxa and Mydei in sustainless or as a third support in their regular team. And generally, she is a very big upgrade over the RMC, especially in terms of raw buffing and utility. And with both teams usually running Cyrene, who of course greatly benefits from Robin being a remembrance unit with fast attacks to help ramp up and get her ult quicker throughout the battle, allowing her to better enable Mydei and Anaxa's performance. Now we can move on to Mono Rem, which is one of her best teams, where she's replacing Cyrene in the best casteress team and the RMC for the main DPS Evernight comp, all because of her better raw buffing on top of good utility. Casteress of course appreciates Robin's birds as another source of new bud, while Evernight appreciates Robin's advances and energy, especially since it's much easier to time her advances in order to pull off a double Evernight explosion either for more damage or new bud for Casteress. Plus, the team's high attack frequency also results in faster vibe stacking for Robin, which is overall neat since another great teammate for Mono Rem always makes splitting up Evernight and Casteress in endgame so much easier. But it is worth noting that this is based off an E0 to an E0 comparison. If you already have tons of vertical investment on these units like Cyrene, an E0 Robin would obviously not be an upgrade for the team and would need her E1 or E2 for her to compete.
As for Aglaya, well, Robin is pretty much the perfect support for her. He loves Robin's huge raw buffing, which unlike with Sunday, has no uptime issues due to her kit. This is all on top of her also appreciating Robin's energy and easier to time action advances. Plus, from experience, a combo of Robin, Cyrene, and Huohuo is more than enough to keep permanent uptime of Aglaya's Supreme stance rather comfortably with no problem. And in return, Aglaya is great for vibe stacking with her high speed and Garment Maker taking tons of turns. And fun fact, their joint attacks give 6 vibes per use if they have Robin's special guest buff since they count as both Aglaya's and Garment Maker's attacks. But despite Robin being a huge upgrade for her, the only real downside is Aglaya herself. Robin sadly isn't enough to bring her back as a top tier unit. So the only thing Aglaya is really missing now is a Nova Flare buff, but you can always make up for this by getting more vertical investment on her. Robin is also a great upgrade for Himeko Nova with a combo of Wealth and Blade or a combo of Wealth and Danheng PT being the best and comfiest options. And she is generally a great upgrade over the RMC due to her bigger raw buffing. And the neat thing is, due to Himeko's S1, Wealth, and Blade's defense reduction, you don't even need that high of a vibe count to reach 100% defense reduction. The only real caveat is that it's actually a lot easier to overcap on defense reduction with the team. Now you can also run an action advancer instead of Wealth or as the third support in Sustainless. But depending on the action advancer, there is a chance you might miss some assist skills due to it becoming pretty difficult to manage all the action advances and Himeko turns. So if you're planning to run an action advancer together with Robin or Himeko, it's recommended to run 2 other Astral Express members in the team to be able to trigger most of Himeko's assist skills. So I highly recommend using either Danheng PT for verdict-focused teams or Wealth for hybrid mode teams to minimize the chances of ever missing an assist skill. While for the action advancer, I highly recommend using the RMC as the action advancer for both teams since they are an Express member and their advance is a bit more manageable to deal with. Plus, it's pretty easy to time Robin's ults around them. And from experience, they won't cause you to miss as much assist skills unless you get their advance right after Himeko's turn. So it's very important that you time their ults to minimize the chance of that happening. You can still use Sunday for the Verdict team or Sparkle for a more decimation-focused team. But just note when using them, it's a lot harder to time Robin's action advances without missing some assist skills. So again, I highly recommend just using the RMC for comfort and ease of use if you want to run a double advancer Himeko setup with Robin. And it is important to note that Himeko's E2 doesn't work on Robin since Robin will almost never take turns once she enters the fever state. But moving on to a really great team, which is Ashblade. And in my opinion, this is one of her best teams due to how much it has going for it, as well as how synergistic it is. First of all, Robin's variable buffing is great for buffing both Ashvale and Blade on top of her more universal buffs already boosting their damage. But the neat thing is, due to how frequent this duo attacks, they can easily stack and maintain Robin's vibe count at its max of 50 stacks. And because of this, it's actually pretty easy to overcap on defense reduction with the team due to Robin only needing 30 vibes for the team to reach 100% defense reduction. Which isn't really the end of the world since a 100% defense reduction is really great for damage. Now she might not attack as fast as 3B, but her birds still have a good attack frequency, especially with a high-speed Robin. So she still most definitely helps Ashvale get tons of energy or helps Blade proc lots of bonus skills. Plus, Ashvale really appreciates the action advance and energy for more ults, which is especially helpful since this team is usually bottlenecked by Ashvale's energy rotation. And this isn't even considering how good Robin's E1 or E2 is for the team. So yes, in my opinion, she is an upgrade over 3B and definitely an upgrade over Gilgamesh, which is neat since it helps free 3B up for other teams and Gilgamesh for Saber Mesh. Now, Robin is also a great upgrade for a main DPS Gilgamesh team. But sadly, Blade is still required to make this team endgame viable. But this team is of course very similar to the Ashblade team when it comes to the benefits it gets from Robin. Robin's buffing utility is just so much better for this team compared to the other previous third slot options. Her frequent attacking birds also help charge Gilgamesh's interest, plus her advance and energy is great for his energy rotations. It's also worth to mention that just like with Ashblade, this team has an easier time reaching 100% def reduction. So overall, this is a much better Hypercarry guild team, but I would still consider Ashblade to be a bit better. Now, another really good team for Robin is Saber Mesh, which frees up the RMC or Mortanax for other teams. And of course, they really appreciate her team-wide buffing, plus both of their frequent attacks is great for stacking vibes. But her ult is also super beneficial for them, with its energy giving one of them 72 energy per use. Plus, they greatly benefit from its action advance, which can help them get more joint attacks. And if you time Robin's advance correctly, it can greatly improve the team's damage dealing efficiency. For example, if you use Robin's ult right after Saber's skill and ult combo, it allows you to immediately use her enhanced basic to get its mana burst effect, which, if you have enough energy, can possibly allow for another skill and ult combo, especially if you manage to proc a joint attack mid-combo. Now, the only real issue is that this team has a ton of attack already, so Robin's own attack buff does already give diminishing returns. However, with her attack buff being so big, it will most definitely still result in huge damage. But with that being said, Mortanax's buffs are significantly more undiluted for the team. So how much of an upgrade Robin is heavily depends on how well you can make use of her action advances and energy for the team. But before we end, I would just like to mention that she also works well with Summer Aventurine, but I'll talk more about him on his own separate video so I can go more in depth about him. And of course, as a generalist buffer, she can work in more teams, not just the ones I talked about in this video. So here are some examples of other comps that I simply couldn't fit in the video because she fits in too many teams. Now just note, DPSs like the Herta, OG Blade, Jingliu, and Jingyuan are simply too outdated at this point, so they're mainly here just for fun. But that's about it. Personally, I'm definitely gonna be pulling for Robin and getting her E2 simply because of how broken she is. Well, that, and I've been a Robin fan since her debut. But anyway, make sure to tell me what you think about her in the comments below, and don't forget to hit me with a like and a sub.